So ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to introduce to you Ella Haley. Ella is a counselor with Open Doors Children Mental Health of Lanark County. She is as you can see from her screen, a psychotherapist with them, but is bringing a sensory integration background. And she's going to basically share with us in the time that we have how mental health and sensory integration are really related. So Ella, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. All right. So as Rob was saying, today I'm going to talk to you guys about sensory integration and mental health. Thanks everybody for tuning in. As Rob was saying, I am a counselor at Open Doors. I'm also an occupational therapist and a psychotherapist. So I'll tell you a little bit about me before we get started. So in the past, when I first started out after graduating from my master's, I worked in like the schools in the Champlain-Lynn, so in the Ottawa region, basically doing assessments within the consultative model for fine motor, gross motor, sensory processing, all of that for individuals in schools. But because it was consultative, I did less of the interventions and treatments and more just writing up the assessments. And from the questionnaire I sent out, a lot of you guys have had a school-based occupational therapist come in and provide that assessment. So I did do that for about a year. And then I also worked privately in a private practice doing the same thing, but also there was a mental health component, and I was working with kids with their families in their homes and doing a little bit of everything. So that's a bit about me and my past. And currently right now I've been at Open Doors for a year and a half, I think. So I've been mostly focusing on the mental health piece, but really being aware of how sensory also is impacting mental health as well. So by no means, I want to kind of make this clear and be transparent kind of coming out of the gate here, is by no means do I feel that I'm an expert in this field. I haven't taken any additional sensory processing trainings or have any additional credentials. I'm really speaking to you from my own personal experience, from what I've read, from what I've learned in my master's degree, and it's my own current knowledge right now. So that could change in a year from now. I'm really just hoping that I can talk to you guys. And if you know something that I don't, please correct me. We can kind of have a conversation, I guess, at the end later on. All right. So just a little disclaimer. This presentation is really for educational purposes only. It's not meant to take the place of a therapist and providing that individualized approach. And it's also not meant for you to walk away saying, I have a sensory processing challenge, or I have sensory processing disorder, or my kid does. So I really want to make that clear. And depending on the unique needs of your child, there could be many reasons, or yourself, there could be many reasons why you do certain behaviors. It might not be related to sensory processing. It could be a combination. It could be related to past trauma, attachment. There's many things to take into consideration. So I know through the questionnaire that I sent, some people were hoping that they'd get some coping strategies out of this. And it's hard for me to really provide those strategies that would be applicable, because coping strategies are very individualized. It works for some, it works for others, and there's many things to take into consideration. So I won't really be providing that today. And the last thing is, sensory processing disorder is actually not a disorder in the DSM-5. So some of you might know that already. It isn't. Many leaders in the field are advocating for it to be part of the DSM-5 as an official diagnosis that doctors can give. Some doctors will write in their, I've seen it kind of in their little prescription pads or referral pads, where they'll say, see this individual for sensory processing disorder. So it just really depends on the doctor that you get. Some are recognizing it and some aren't. But the sensory processing challenges are under certain diagnoses in the DSM. But a lot more research is needed in the area. Okay, so my goals for everybody today is really to be able to walk away identifying the basics of sensory integration, to identify how sensory processing challenges can impact daily functioning and mental health, be able to list the potential cues and or behaviors that may be associated to sensory processing challenges, and identify how you can support a child or yourself who may experience sensory processing challenges. Just of note here, you might notice that there's sensory integration and then there's sensory processing challenges. Leaders in the field have really identified the importance of stating that sensory integration is that process that our body, our body processing sensory information, and then sensory processing challenges or sensory processing disorder is the term that we use when there's a challenge with sensory integration. They're really the same thing, so don't get confused when I'm talking about the two words. All right, and most people, when I sent out the questionnaire, were pretty familiar with what sensory integration or sensory processing was, and that's kind of why we're just going to jump right in today into, for the purposes of time, just kind of talking more in depth about it and not going over the basics. And most people were familiar with the connection to mental health. I'm going to go over that again. And what else did everyone say? Oh, yeah, I talked about it a little bit more. Some people wanted those coping skills, but also people just wanted to further their understanding of what sensory processing is. And if you've had an assessment done by an OT, I'm hoping you can kind of take what they've said and really try to make sense of it more in your head based off what I'm talking about today. All right, so we'll dive right into the sensory systems. There are actually 8 sensory systems. Most people are familiar with the basics, the 5 senses that we learn when we're younger. So hearing, seeing, touching, smell, and taste. Those are the 5 basic ones. There are 3 that most people are less familiar with. So that's proprioception, vestibular input, vestibular sensory system, and interoception. And interoception is actually a newer sensory system that people are talking about. More research is needed in this area, and it's kind of emerging. So depending on which website you go to, some have actually not identified it yet, and some have, or some books haven't, some have. I will explain it a little bit today. All right, so the proprioceptive system. This is the system that really helps us understand our body and where it is in space. It helps us kind of create a body scheme, a body image of what we're doing that we use in everyday activities. So if you imagine like brushing your hair, you have a hairbrush in your hand, you need to know where your hand is and where your head is in order to bring that brush to your head. And that's just one example. There are so many things that we do. Like if you're getting out of bed and you're walking out of the room, you need to know where your body is in relation to the door. I am somebody that often runs into the sides of walls and not because I'm in a rush, just because I have less awareness of where my body is in space. So I appear a little bit clumsy to some people. That's mostly my proprioceptive system at play. And this system can also help regulate physiological arousal levels. So I'm really going to talk about that later and how that relates to mental health and our sensory system. This picture up here that I put in here, I liked because it talks about some of the strategies that help in kind of working on or strengthening that sort of proprioceptive system. So like the body sock allows you to feel where your limbs are in space. Yoga too as well, there's more pressure being applied into your muscles. So they've got the therapy ball, the trampoline, and the weighted ball as well up there. Some of examples that many younger kids would be where they'd be using their proprioceptive system and actually taking away their vestibular system would be, that classic game of pin the tail on the donkey or smashing the piñata at a party. Basically, you're putting a blindfold over your eyes, you're taking away your visual system, and you're having to rely on where your body is in space in order to perform the task. So that is really highlighting the proprioceptive system. You're also using other systems, so it's not like, it's just the proprioceptive system. We're also using the vestibular system, which is about balance. The other thing I want to highlight about this is many of us will use our proprioceptive, we'll use proprioceptive input in order to screen out other uncomfortable sensations. So just because someone's demonstrating certain behaviors that are proprioceptive, that doesn't mean they have a challenge with their proprioceptive system. For example, at the dentist, I often, I don't know what the tool is called, but they'll put this little tool and it makes that really high-pitched sound in your mouth when you're at the dentist. And it bothers me, like it bothers, from an auditory perspective, it bothers me. So what I end up doing is I actually will push my hands together, or I push my body into the chair, and I'm not moving, but what I'm doing is I'm using proprioceptive input to distract from that auditory input. And I do it naturally. I didn't actually notice until I, was putting this presentation together. And so until I started learning about sensory integration, that this is something that I do without even realizing. So that's important just to remember that piece is we can see certain behaviors, but it doesn't actually mean there's a challenge in that system. All right. So some individuals with proprioceptive challenges may demonstrate the following. So they might appear clumsy or inattentive. They might fatigue easily. They might use too much or too little pressure when handling objects. They may have difficulties getting into body positions necessary to perform different tasks. They might seek out more than that typical rough and tumble play, and seeking that deep pressure by squeezing into tight places. So that might be squeezing between the couch cushions and getting down really low. I was a kid that used to put my bed up against the wall and squeeze in between the cold wall, which I loved. So that's another sensory system, the cold wall as well as my bed, and would squeeze my body in between. So that's also providing that proprioceptive input. And then also individuals might need extra firm pressure to relax their system. And the visual system too, and the proprioceptive system often work together, or the visual system might compensate for challenges that you have in the proprioceptive system. Okay, so the next one is the vestibular system. So this system is really the system that detects that movement. The sensory receptors responsible for this are in our inner ears. And it really provides us with an understanding of acceleration, deceleration. Are we moving circular? So if you think about being on a train, how do we know, if we were to actually blindfold ourselves, how do we know that the train is slowing down or speeding up? If we weren't looking outside the windows, we kind of have this sense of where we are, of what movement is going on. Again, there's some pictures up here. So balancing on a ball, a scooter board, a swing, so that you can tell you're going back and forth, as well as animal walks. And this system really is believed to play a major role in regulating all the other systems, where information can be turned up or it can be turned down, and that assists in our ability to self-regulate. I'll talk about the self-regulation piece a little bit later. So if we think about certain vestibular sensations, they can be really calming or they can be really excitatory for our nervous system. So bouncing on a ball or jumping up and down on a trampoline, that really excites our nervous system. But certain slow rhythmic rocking, for example, is going to be very calming to us. If you think about a little baby, we often rock them to sleep, and that's vestibular. That's a calming vestibular strategy that people will use, and that can be applicable even now. You might find that now you'll be in a hammock and it's very calming to you. So that is the vestibular system, and some challenges that people may have if they have vestibular system challenges would be, or what they appear like, is being fearful of any changes in gravity and position, becoming dizzy or nauseated with movement. They may avoid stairs, bicycles, or playground equipment. They may crave movement, so being on the complete opposite spectrum, and they're constantly engaging in movement activities, jumping, bumping into people, climbing, or they might also have difficulties maintaining attention for long periods of time, or for any length of time for that matter, because they're constantly seeking out that movement. And again, I want to highlight the importance that just because someone is showing that vestibular, like if they're showing behaviors related to the vestibular system, it might not mean they have challenges with the vestibular system. It might just be because they're actually trying to screen out other uncomfortable stimuli. So that kind of highlights the importance of being a behavioral detective and really trying to figure out what's going on. What is the reason for this behavior? It might not mean because there's challenges in the vestibular system. All right, the next system is the interoceptive system. This might be one that some of you have heard of or you haven't heard of, I'm not sure. This system is really the system where we sense what is going on in our body, like answering that question, how do you feel? So if I were to ask you kind of like, how do you know that you're sleepy? Or how do you know that you have to go to the bathroom? Like what are those body cues that tell you what's, you know, that you have to do something? So with being hungry, it's often that sense of like, well, I have this sort of empty feeling in my stomach. I don't know, it's just there. With going to the bathroom as well, there's just this feeling, or being tired, your eyes might feel really like heavy. You might like, your body feels really slow. You have like no control over your body movements. Some other things that the interoceptive system is responsible for is that, you know, knowing like what our body temperature is, like, are we really hot? Are we really cold? Are we thirsty? Do we need a glass of water? And so this system works with all the other systems in the body, and particularly the proprioceptive and vestibular system I just talked about. It's important to remember that as much as I'm trying to describe these systems separately, they all work together all the time. It's really hard to distinguish them. And some researchers believe that this system is really responsible for that like emotional awareness piece. So what is going on in my body? Like, in recognizing, am I really anxious? Am I really frustrated? What do I need to do in this moment to help me? So some people might have like really muted responses or not picking up on those sensory cues. And I'll talk about that in the next slide. So if you have any challenges with your interoceptive system, you might have difficulties knowing when you need to go to the bathroom or not. So some people actually might not have cues that they need to go to the bathroom, so they might have bathroom accidents. Some people might actually feel like if they have a little bit of liquid in their bladder, they feel like they need to pee. Like it's the same as if they had a full bladder, so they're constantly going to the bathroom. So they're more sensitive to those sensory cues. Other things, if you have a challenge, you might not eat often, like you might not really realize that sense of hunger, or you might eat more than is needed. Other things would be having difficulties with that self-regulation piece. And so that really, this piece is what ties into also the mental health component, is you might miss out on those cues of frustration or anxiety. For even the neurotypical individual, we are still taught what those cues mean, right? So we often don't know what that means. Like, what does it mean when we're tired? We're taught when we're younger, like, you're tired, you have a shorter temper than normal, or you're crying a lot, so that means you're tired. And you learn over time how to listen to your body. So for even anybody so it's true for anybody, but then if you have interoceptive system challenges, you also need to be taught as well, but there might need to be different strategies that are put in place. If you're, say, for example, your cues, that you have a muted sense of what's going on in your body, well, then maybe there needs to be like scheduled bathroom breaks every so often, because you can't pick up on those cues, and that's okay. It just means we have to figure out a way in which you can function best. Okay. So talked a little bit about the different sensory systems, and now I'm going to go into like how they classify sensory processing challenges or sensory processing disorder. And then I'm really going to go into one of the sensory assessments that's used the most, that I'm most familiar with. Sorry, I believe is used the most from what I've heard from my colleagues, but that take that with a grain of salt, because we're in one area of the province, and I don't really know what's being used down in the States or maybe in other areas of Ontario. So sensory processing disorder is basically divided up into 3 different types of disorders. There's sensory discrimination disorder, sensory modulation disorder, sensory-based motor disorder. Sensory discrimination disorder is really when you have difficulties identifying the differences between the sensory stimuli. So the differences between visual input or auditory input. Sensory-based motor disorder is when you have difficulties with like the sequencing, planning, and actually executing motor movements. So they often call it praxis. So that's why you see up there dyspraxia. And then sensory modulation disorder, which is the one that I'm going to be mostly focusing on today, is basically when our ability of our brain to kind of focus on that sensory information that is the most important, to tune out what's irrelevant. And it's kind of like a remote control. So, or turning up the volume, turning down the volume, and knowing what is the sensory information I need to pay attention to and what is the information I can just disregard. So there are 3 different categories within that: sensory over-responsive, under-responsive, and sensory seeking. There's like lots of terminology here. The next assessment I'm going to talk about, basically 2 of the categories go into each of these. That's less important for you to remember. If you can just kind of understand I'm talking about sensory modulation, that's really what you need to take away from this. So the sensory profile 2 is the one, I'm not sure if many people have had this one, they've completed it themselves, or if they've had it sent home by an OT doing a school-based assessment. Really what this is it's a series of questions that give you a score at the end, and that score is compared to other like neurotypical individuals. So whether or not you seek out certain sensory input more than others, less than others, and you get a score in 4 different quadrants, 6 different sensory categories, and 3 different behavioral sections. And I'm going to go through kind of the quadrants to help you understand it a little bit more. Okay, so the quadrants are broken up into 2 different things. I'm going to talk about the red. So look, if you're looking at the red arrow is threshold. So what our threshold is really the amount of sensory stimuli that your body can handle before you react to a situation. So if you have a high threshold, you require more sensory input in order to react. So you're probably going to react slower. If you have a low threshold, you require less sensory stimuli in order to react. So you're going to react faster. The orange arrow is about self-regulation. So the orange arrow is really about what do individuals do in certain situations in order to control or manage that sensory stimuli. Like what is their behavior and their self-regulation? So active self-regulators are people that kind of control and manage the sensory stimuli and will do things. Passive self-regulators are individuals that most often just let the environment happen and then they'll react after. So they're less active in trying to manage the sensory input. So with the quadrant, then you get 4 different like kind of labels or areas: sensory seeker, low registration, sensory sensitivity, and sensory avoider. I'm going to go through each one for you guys to understand a little bit more. It's important though that it's not like an all or nothing. It's not like once you get a score, you are a sensory seeker and that's the category that you're in. You can be in one category for different sensory input and be in a different category. And I hope that becomes clear as we start talking. Okay, so as an analogy, I want you to think of the environment as a tap. Okay, and water dripping from that tap is going to be the sensory stimuli in that environment. Now, we as human beings are cups, okay? And our cup isn't just static, it's not the same size every day, all day, but basically some of us have bigger cups, some of us have smaller cups. The cup size depends on the time of day, our strategies that we use, etc. But to function optimally, all of us need to have cups that are kind of completely full. They can't be overfilling, they can't be too empty. So in order to function at our best, we need full cups, okay? When we receive too much or not enough sensory stimuli, when our cups are overflowing or there's not enough water in them, then it influences how we function and how we behave. Okay, so sensory seeker, the first category I'm going to talk about. These are individuals that are active, so they go out of their way, they turn that tap on to try to get more sensory input into their system, or they might shut it off if it's too much, but they have big cups, so they can handle a lot more. They have a high threshold. So individuals in this category, what they may look like would be people that, you know, touch people or objects to the point where it's annoying. They might also pursue movement to the point where it interferes with their daily routine because they're constantly seeking out that sensory input. They might smell non-food objects or crave certain food tastes or smells, and they could also put non-food objects in their mouth just to help them. Okay, the next section is low registration. So these individuals are more passive, so they still have those big cups, but they're more passive in the sense that they don't go out of their way to try to get more sensory input. So really they just let the water flow, or they have overflowing cups, or they don't have enough water in their cup at all. These are people that might seem unaware of pain or temperature changes. They might bump into things, failing to notice objects or people in the way. They might also seem accident prone or oblivious within an active environment. So what I talked a little bit about before, me running sometimes into walls or like cutting corners, that would be an example of low registration. It actually happens more when I'm not in an active environment and I don't have a lot of sensory input. Okay, the next section is sensory sensitivity. So these are individuals with a tiny little cup, and as much as the picture there shows that it's overflowing, it doesn't mean it's always overflowing. It just can happen, right? Water can, if we have a tiny little cup and we're in an environment that we don't go out of our way to control or manage the sensory input, the cup can overflow quickly. And so these are individuals that are bothered potentially by bright lights more than same-age children. They might become very anxious when standing close in line to other people, but they don't really do much about it. So they'll be like very anxious within themselves, but they're not doing anything like hitting the kid in front of them to get out of the way to give space. They might also eat only certain food textures. So that's our sensory, like our oral sensory processing. And they might also struggle to interpret body language. So you could really understand if someone has difficulties interpreting body language, that's going to have a big impact on their social skills, and we're going to talk about that later. The last one is a sensory avoider. So these are individuals that have a small cup, but they do turn that tap on or off to control the sensory stimuli in the environment. So these individuals may hold their hands over their ears to kind of protect their to filter that auditory input that's coming in. They might show an emotional response or an aggressive response to being touched because it's very overwhelming for them. They may appear to be stubborn or uncooperative, resist eye contact, or have temper tantrums. They might also be really distressed in changes in plans, routines, or expectations, and kind of have definite and predictable fears. So again, I want to highlight, you're not just in one category. You can be in one category for one sensory system and be in a different category for another sensory system. You're not just a sensory avoider, and that's that. Okay, so sensory processing challenges impact mental health? Well, that's a very good question. I've talked about the different sensory categories and the potential behaviors that you may see, and now I'm going to talk about kind of living in the world if you do have sensory processing challenges. And I have broken it up, and I'm going to take this concept, well, kind of the concept of primary challenges versus secondary challenges. I don't know if any of you have read this book. I got it from Karen Moore. She recommended I read it, so Trying Differently Rather Than Harder. And basically, she breaks it down into primary behaviors and secondary behaviors, and I love that concept, so I took it. So I'm giving her credit right now. There's primary challenges versus secondary challenges. So primary challenges are really those challenges in mental health that come from living with a sensory processing challenge. And they're directly related to that. So I'll talk about that in the next slides, but self-regulation or social skills. Secondary challenges are those challenges that arise from kind of living in a world where there's a lack of fit between your unique needs or your individual needs and the environment. So for many people with sensory processing challenges, they live in a world that has been designed for the neurotypical person. And there isn't really that fit between the environment and their needs. So if challenges kind of arise, if for many years, basically, you know, you're not understood, or loved ones and caregivers are don't really attempt to understand what you're going through. And we'll talk about maybe what might arise from that after. To dive into the primary challenges, the concept of self-regulation, all right? So self-regulation is the ability to control our emotions, our impulses, our behaviors, and many factors impact our ability to self-regulate, okay? So this can include our cognitive and developmental age, whether we have responsive and nurturing caregivers, whether we've had any past trauma and attachment challenges, whether we've been taught coping strategies. So all of those influence self-regulation, but also sensory modulation and sensory integration can impact our ability to self-regulate. If we don't know how we feel, or the way that we feel means that we're dysregulated, we're not going to implement any coping strategies. If we can't kind of turn up or turn down the amount of sensory information that's coming in from the environment, then we're really at the mercy of what our body is going through. And we all kind of know when we don't feel like we have control, and COVID-19 right now is an example of that, we have really no control of what's happening. The anxiety and our physiological arousal level goes up. And when that goes up, our brain often gets triggered into survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, we know that what happens is we go into fight, flight, or freeze. So it's important to understand there's a big connection between all of these things that are going on. And our body is really trying to keep us safe. So I'm going to talk about physiological arousal level and how that is also tied into self-regulation, sensory input, and I'm going to give an example. Physiological arousal level is our level of alertness. It changes throughout the day. It has an impact on that size of that cup I was talking about earlier. So if I have an optimal arousal level, you know, I'm ready to function, I'm at my best, I can concentrate, I can get things done, I'm productive. If I have a low arousal level, I'm pretty fatigued, I'm moving slowly, I'm not functioning at my best. And if I have a high arousal level, I'm very, very alert, but I'm so alert to the point where I might be really anxious, I might be melting down, frustrated, have a really fast heartbeat. So this all changes throughout our day, but our ability to maintain and to stay within that green zone, that optimal arousal level, is dependent kind of on our ability to balance sensory input that's coming in from the environment. So I'm going to give you an example, and it's going to be a little boy. So say this individual wakes up in the morning, or actually before I start that, this individual is a sensory avoider. So if you remember that, he's a sensory avoider to auditory and visual input only. Okay, so that means he can handle less sensory input from the auditory system and his visual system. And he's going to try to manage and control that within the environment. So he wakes up in the morning. You guys can see here the little dot, he's down in the blue. He's quite tired, but immediately he starts thinking about what's going to happen today. I have to go to school. So his arousal level just goes through the roof. And he passes the green zone, he's in the yellow zone. Say his parents come in, they comfort him, they provide reassurance, he goes and he eats breakfast, he takes his dog for a walk. He uses certain coping strategies to come back down into the optimal level of arousal. And then what happens is he gets on the bus. And we all know school buses are very noisy, they are very loud, they there's lots of movement. So not only the movement from the bus moving and static objects kind of going past, but also like kids like throwing objects, people yelling. It's just an environment that can be very overwhelming. So what ends up happening in that environment, he gets on the bus, he's very overwhelmed. He tries to put on his headphones. He tries to listen to music, but it's just the noise is too loud that day. And someone tries to talk to him and he just snaps at them. And it has nothing to do with that person and what they said to him. He's so overwhelmed. And then he gets to school. Oh, I don't know why that went back. Okay, so then he gets to school and he sees his teacher. He likes his teacher. His teacher's welcomes him. He feels a little bit better. He gets to see his best friend. He transitions into class slowly. And then, so he's feeling a little bit better, but he's still heightened. He's still a bit worried about the day, what's going to happen. And then what goes on is his teacher announces to the class that, well, today we're going to have a fire drill and we're going to have this in half an hour. And so what I need from all of you is we're going to line up and then we're going to go out this route and we're going to go outside where the rest of the school is. And as soon as he hears this, he knows what a fire drill sounds like. He gets more worried and he gets more anxious and his arousal level goes up again. He starts to kind of argue with the teacher because he doesn't want this to happen. And then the teacher doesn't really understand what's going on. She's like, well, we have to do this. It's for your safety. His arousal level is really high, and what he ends up doing is he just runs out of the class because he doesn't want to handle it, and he goes to the principal's office. The principal talks to him, tells him, you know, it's okay, the teacher will be there for you, tries to reassure him, say like, you have your headphones that you can put on, the teacher will be right beside you, she'll protect you. So he calms down a little bit. But as you can see this whole time, he's still in the yellow. He hasn't come down into that optimal zone. He's still kind of at that point where one little thing can put him into the red. And then what happens obviously is when the fire drill goes off, the teacher is really distracted. She has to manage 30 students and basically his headphones don't work. And then his body is just done. He goes into a state of survival mode, fight, flight, or freeze. He breaks down. And for him, he's freezing and he's crying and he doesn't want to move. So with this whole example, I really wanted you guys to understand that there are so many things that tie into sensory integration, and it's connected to everything. So our physiological arousal level, the time of day, what our thoughts are, what our feelings are, what our worries are, the people in the environment. So the teachers, the principals, these are all people that are providing coping strategies and helping this little kid regulate their arousal level. But depending on where they're at, it could be one little thing that we don't even know what's going on. I used a pretty extreme example of a fire drill, but it could be one small thing that could take them from the yellow to the red. And we didn't even know that they're in the yellow because they could be a sensory, an individual that doesn't actually show us through aggressive behaviors. They just kind of sit with their feelings of anxiety all day. So I wanted to show you that it's all connected and it is hard to distinguish. All right, the next primary challenge, certainly not the last one, but something that I thought I would highlight is basically social skills. So this, I've highlighted important ones that I think, you know, most schools, well, I think about in our culture at least, this is something that is highly valued, respecting personal space, reading body language, listening to other people. And I really think about someone with sensory processing challenges and where they are expected to demonstrate this is in an environment that is very difficult for them. So it's often at school where there is so much sensory input. And I think about, you know, so someone who constantly needs proprioceptive feedback and is bumping into their peers when they're in line, they might kind of be perceived as somebody that doesn't respect personal space. Someone who has challenges with auditory input, for example, they might be working on a project with a classmate, and when they're working on the project with a classmate, 10 other pairs of students are talking in the class. They can't hear what their partner is saying, but their partner is perceiving them as not caring, not participating, not wanting to work on the project. Another thing is someone, who's maybe trying to regulate their body by humming to tune out other inputs. And a teacher or a classmate might perceive them to be disruptive, rude, or unwilling to listen. So these are all, it's challenging for an individual in a sensory environment, or if they're overloaded and they can't modulate their system to show and to work on social skills. All right, the next thing I'm going to go into is just secondary challenges. So like I talked about before, an individual who lives in the world with a sensory processing challenge, can be labeled fairly quickly. So they can be labeled as the bad kid, the disruptive kid, the kid's not that, doesn't talk, the weird kid. And so imagine living in a world where all these labels have been put on you. No one is trying to understand what you're going through. How do you experience this world and try to support you? Well, obviously there's going to be challenges with that. So some of the secondary challenges that can come from that is, fear or a lack of confidence, anxiety or worry. Like, I worry a lot because no one's really going to help me when I'm in a situation that's overwhelming or that's maybe underwhelming for me. Depression can also come about just in terms of, being labeled and then feeling like a lack of hope and motivation for the future. And also if you're, you constantly go out into the world and your body goes into fight or flight all the time, then really why go out? Why am I motivated to explore the world around me? There's not really a point. Like, it's terrifying out there. There's also additional diagnoses that can come about later on in life. I'm not an expert. Some of the links I've seen or some of the research that I've looked into has kind of started to look into developmental disorders, autism, sensory processing challenges, and their association with like social anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive behaviors or disorder, as well as any internalizing, so anxiety and depression behaviors, or externalizing behaviors, so aggression, fighting, and those types of externalizing behaviors. Okay, so when I think about all of that, everything I've talked about, for me, it's extremely important to be mindful that the way that I experience the world or the way that someone else experiences the world is very, very different than how another person will experience the world. And it's so important to be mindful of that. Not one way is better than the other. So who am I to come along and tell somebody, they're not right for the way that they're experiencing the world? And if I'm, if a child's doing something instinctively that helps them self-regulate, so they're humming, okay, they're humming to like drown out other sensory input, and I come along and I tell them to stop doing that, what I'm really saying to them is, your experience isn't valid, you're not really right for doing that, and I'm taking away a coping strategy. So this isn't to say that obviously there are social expectations, and sometimes in certain environments we need to find a different coping strategy. But if I kind of immediately come in and shut them down, that's not building trust. That's affecting the attachment between us, and they're not going to be really willing to want to listen and learn other coping strategies because I don't really know what it's like for them. So how do we support individuals with sensory processing challenges? As a caregiver or a trusted adult, the most important thing, and I cannot stress this enough, is building a safe and non-judgmental space. If you do not have this, it's going to be very hard for you to get any therapy done. Never mind therapy, but just any sort of connection. So you really need to have this. This is a foundation of everything. It seems very simple, but it is actually very difficult. And because what often happens is we have other things that get in the way. We have our own trauma, our own self-values, our own fears and worries that get in the way, our own capacity and stress level, our physiological arousal level. And that is something at Open Doors that we help with, right? It's not about judging where you're at. It's about like helping you self-explore, like what's going on that's impacting your ability to create that safe space. So it's very difficult to do. And I am constantly striving to do that. And really it's about self-reflection and looking back on, okay, what's going on right now? The other thing is just being curious. So being curious as to why kiddos do what they do, or why you do what you do, like what's going on in my body, and not judging it, just trying to figure out like what was going on there, what happened, and then accepting it. Accept, like, that's okay, that's your experience, and accepting, it might not be that we're accepting the behavior long term, but we're accepting that that was what happened in the moment. And I think it's important to say here too, like being empathetic towards why people are doing what they're doing, and that things may be overwhelming even though we don't understand it. We might have no idea what's going on. We can't put ourselves in their shoes because our body works differently, but just being empathetic towards their feelings and validating that their experience is true. So the moment you kind of create that safe space, the moment you understand your kid or you have that connection, then things will start to be put into place. And there are so many free resources, or there are so many resources out there that then you can use, but you really also have to have that to begin with. So the next thing would be is, it's on the second page because to me it's not as important, but a change in perspective. So really, by virtue of you guys being here today, you're trying to understand sensory processing challenges a little bit more. You might read up on it, you might look on the internet, you might attend additional seminars, self-education, all of that's going to help you kind of change your perspective and not attribute behaviors related to just, okay, well, that child's trying to manipulate me, which I don't agree with at all. The next thing would be recognizing those early signs. So there's a checklist that I have put up right here in a picture, and then in the back of my slides, there's a resource or the link that takes you right to the website, and it comes from this book, which is also in the back. A lot of the presentation came through, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, but Building Bridges Through Sensory Integration, and it's a great book to understand. It kind of breaks everything down. So that comes from it. It's for free, and just going through it, and you can check off certain things that might be applicable. And if there's a lot that you're checking off, then it would probably cue you to go get some more expertise and help in this area. As an occupational therapist or a healthcare professional in this role, their job is really to build rapport. Like I said, that creating that safe space, a non-judgmental atmosphere, that is the most important. Once they have that, there's additional things like I talked about before, being a behavioral detective. And really that comes from working with the family, getting all people that are involved into the conversation, the teachers, the kids, because the more we can understand all the situations where behavior is happening, then we can really start to understand the reasons behind behavior. And also, whoever is the person that is part of this assessment should be the one that's leading it. So they're going to tell us if they can. I mean, the challenge is if you're working with a kid with autism, some of them are nonverbal, so you have to use additional strategies to communicate with them. But if you can, really try to just ask questions, figure out like what's going on, the reasons why they're doing what they're doing. The OT also is responsible for identifying that fit between the person and the environment, and whether any other recommendations can be made to support this kid or this individual in that environment. So sensory diets, additional tools, you may know of a lot of them. We're not going to go into that today because it's really important that you have an individualized perspective that understands the whole picture before you start using any of those tools. Okay, so that's really the end of my presentation.